Good morning, guys. So what we're going to start with in discrete class, we're going to start a new unit focusing on elections, right? We're going to focus on how to analyze elections, Congress. We're going to start off with the basics, even analyzing how certain states have more congressional seats than other states, right? Again, before anything, congressional seat basically are seats literally in Congress. So Congress in Washington, D.C. is made up of the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. The U.S. Senate always has 2 seats per state. So it doesn't matter how big a state is, how small a state is, whether it's Texas or whether it's literally Rhode Island, each of them has 2. That's always automatic. When it comes to the House of Representatives in Congress, right, because it has 2. It has the U.S. Senate, has the U.S. House of Representatives. The House of Representatives has 435 seats in it, right? So there are 435 people that represent the U.S. House of Representatives. Those 435, that all depends on the population of every state. So if a state is bigger, they're going to have more people there representing them. If the state is smaller, they're going to have fewer people representing them there, right? And all that depends is population. A bigger state like California or Texas is going to have more representatives in the House of Representatives than, let's say, like a state like North Dakota or South Dakota, because there are more people in California and Texas than there are in North or South Dakota. So they're going to have more people representing them. So what we're going to work with today, we're going to start, and we're going to work with this over 2 classes. We're going to start working with something that you've never heard of called the apportionment issue, the apportionment principle. Apportionment principle. And just to start off, what the apportionment principle is, the word apportionment is a way that we can actually evenly divide certain things amongst people, right? So let's say that we have a group of people that they're dividing up food for dinner, right? If you have a person that is bigger and needs more food and all that than a person that's tiny and gets full very quickly, the person that's smaller and needs less food isn't going to eat as much as a person that needs more food. Just naturally, you compare me to a person that weighs like 60 pounds, I'm naturally going to eat more than a person that weighs 60 pounds. So it wouldn't be fair to just give me the same amount as somebody else. Same thing, you compare animals, let's say. You have a bear, and then you have, let's say, the snake. The bear is naturally going to eat more food than the snake. So when it comes to actually divvying up and dividing the food, we're not trying to say you get 50, you get 50. We're trying to say you're bigger, so you need more, and you're smaller, so you need less. Same idea. When it comes to figuring out how many representatives from each state go to Congress, they use that same idea. If you're a bigger state, you're going to get more representatives. If you're a smaller state, you're going to get fewer representatives. That's what the apportionment principle is used for. Apportionment principle is used to figuring out fairly and evenly how many representatives each person is going to get, how to evenly split up things fairly. I should take away the word evenly. How to split a certain amount fairly amongst the groups of people, right? So we're going to go into that again. The one example that I'm going to focus on is going to be that situation where we're working with states. Now, the apportionment principle does not only apply to Congress. It doesn't only apply to figuring out how many representatives go to Congress. It's just a way that we're applying this right now because we are analyzing elections and the electoral system, all of that. We're analyzing different ways of analyzing the election system here in the US and how things come up, how these numbers come up, right? So we're tying it to that. But let's say that I were to say one person read 500 pages of a book, another person read 200 pages, and I want to divide up money fairly based on how many pages a person read. That would be the apportionment issue. Because if a person read more, they're going to get more money. If a person read less, they're going to get less money. That idea. It's more reward for people that have more, less reward for people that did less too, right? In terms of states, The bigger the state, the more they get. The smaller the state, the less they get. So we're going to analyze this, right? So I'm going to have a table, okay? And that table is going to have state A, state A, state B, state C, and state D, right? We got 4 states. We have 4 states in this example, right? And there are going to be certain words that you haven't heard of yet, and that's okay. But again, I will explain everything thoroughly for you guys to understand. So the first thing I'm going to end up giving you for each of them is going to be their population, right? How many people actually live in each of these states, right? So the population for state A is going to be, here, let me write this in different colors, just so it's not all the same for you guys. The first state is going to have 17,130 people. State B is going to end up having 22,100 people. State C is going to end up having 10,220 people. And state D is going to end up having 15,170 people, right? So this is how many people are in each state. So even before anything else, if we're trying to figure out how many seats, how many representatives from each state are going to go to Congress, we already know. This state's going to get the most because there are more people. So if you're a bigger state, you need more representatives. We know that this state is going to get the least amount because since it's the smallest amount of people, it needs the least amount of representatives, right? So it's that idea. And then there's going to be this other word called a quota, which I'll explain. And again, today we're going to start with just analyzing how to start the process of figuring this out, right? Today we're going to focus on analyzing the population to figure out the quota. The quota is what we're going to use then in the next lesson to be able to figure out an exact number of how many representatives each person's getting, each state's getting. But for today, I want to get you guys started in the process just to be able to start understanding what you have to do in order to be able to go through this. So a quota is going to be a rough estimate of how many people are going to go, how many representatives each one's going to have. It's not the exact number, but again, the next lesson we're going to focus on that more. Today we're going to find the quota, and then we're going to end up finding something else called a divisor, which we'll get to. Again, all this will make sense, I do promise. So whenever we want to figure out, start getting a general idea of how many representatives each state is going to get, we have to calculate something that's called a divisor. And what a divisor is the number that's going to tell us what we're going to divide each population by, right? Because that divisor is going to help us figure out how many representatives each state's going to have, right? So the divisor is the number that we need to figure out that's going to tell us what to divide each of those populations by. The way that we figure that out, first and foremost, what we have to do is we have to figure out how many people total there are, right? So we have 17,130, we have 22,100, we have 10,220, we have 15,170. To figure out the total population, which is always the first thing that we have to do. We have to figure out how much we're actually working with total. We would take all 4 of those numbers and add them up. And once we add up all 4 of those numbers, it's going to end up giving us 64,620, right? So right now, again, whenever you start this process, you have to always figure out your total. What's your total population? And once we have this, our total population, now we can figure out the divisor. So the divisor is going to be that number that we're going to tell us what we're going to divide everything by, right? But in order to know what the divisor is, we need to know how many seats, how many representatives they're going to end up being to split, right? You need to know whether there's only 10 to split amongst all of them, whether there's only 30 to split amongst all of them. We need to know that. In this case, I'm going to tell you that we are going to have 45 congressional seats. Here, let me write this in a bigger space. We are going to have 45 congressional seats to split up, right? And again, you hear congressional seat, you may be a little confused. All a congressional seat is, it's a representative. we have 45 congressional seats. We have 45 representatives that we're gonna split up, right? So amongst all of this, once we do everything, there are only gonna be 45 representatives, right? So again, like we said, from those 45 representatives, we know there are gonna be more representatives in this one. We know there are gonna be less representatives in this one, because that's the biggest number, that's the smallest, right? So out of all of this, we only have 45 representatives to split up. The way that you figure out the divisor, you take the total and divide it by what you have to split up. So in this case, our total is 64,000. Let me do it in a different color. We have 64,200. 64,620. And we're going to divide that by how many we have to share, 45. Okay? So all we always do, the way you always figure out the divisor, you take the total and divide it by what we're splitting up evenly, right? Splitting up fairly. In this case, we have 64,620 people. We're going to divide it amongst the 45 seats that are there. And when we divide those two numbers, it's going to end up giving us 1,436, right? So right there, that number is extremely important because that number is what's telling us what we're going to divide these populations by. That divisor is what helps us find everything. So again, before you can do any of this, before you can figure out how many representatives each state's going to get, you have to figure out how many people there are total, right? So we added up all these numbers and it gave us 64,620. To find the divisor, the 1,436, we need to take the total and divide it by how many we're splitting amongst everybody. In this case, we're splitting up 45 seats. So we did 64,620, the total, divided by how much we're splitting up, right? And once you figure that out, that divided by that, it gives us 1,436. That number is what we're going to divide all of these by to find our quota, because our quota is the process that we start to figure it out. Once you figure out the quota, everything else becomes easy, right? So again, always the same steps, and I want to repeat it again just so you guys realize it. When it comes to figuring out the divisor, which is the first thing we need, you got to figure out the total, so add up everything. You're going to divide it then by how many we're splitting. So 64,620 divided by 45 seats is going to give us 1,436. That 1,436, that's our divisor, right? That's the number that we need. Just going to move this up. So we know that our divisor is 1,436. This is the number that we're going to be using now to figure out all of our quotas. It's the one number that you need the most. Because once you have that, the rest is all easy. It's extremely, extremely easy next. Because now, a divisor is exactly that. A divisor is a number that tells us what to divide by, right? So, let's figure it out. Now you're going to go state by state. We're going to take each state divided by that. So we're going to do 17,130. Divide that by 1,436. And when we divide those two, 17,130 divided by 1,436, it's going to give us 11.93. That's our first quota. Our first quota right there is 11.93. And what that is a rough estimate of approximately how many representatives that state's going to have. So they're going to have approximately 11.93, which isn't exact yet. That's what we're going to do next class, right? Next one. So that was state A. Now we're going to calculate the quota for state B. State B, we're going to take 22,100. We're going to divide that by divisor. Always divide by the divisor, 1,436. It's going to end up giving us 15.39. And I'm just rounding it to the hundredths place. 15.39. That right there is our quota for state B. Okay? 15.39. Let me erase that. 15.39, that's our quota for state B. Okay. State C, always the same process, guys. State C now, we're gonna take its population, 10,220. 10,220, divide that by the divisor, 1,436. It's gonna end up giving us 7.12, right? So that's our quota for state C, 7.12. And now the last one we have to do, let us do state D, right? State D, we're gonna end up doing 15,170 divided by 1,436. You always divide by the divisor. That's why the divisor is so important. When we divide 15,170 by 1,436, it gives us 10.56. 10.56. Right? And this is what we're focusing on just today's, right? Today's lesson, I wanted to focus on just finding those quotas, right? And now, let me get rid of this math. Because again, math is extremely easy, guys. It's simple, it's direct, it's just knowing where everything is coming from, right? And think back to what we said. That's 11.93, that's 15.39, that's 7.12, that's 10.56. We said at the beginning, to do this fairly, the biggest population would have the biggest number, which it does. We said that the smallest population would have the smallest number, which it does, because more people deserve more representatives. Fewer people deserve fewer representatives. The next biggest deserves the second most representatives. The second smallest deserves the second smallest representatives. That's what it is, right? And so what we're gonna do the next class, we're gonna take these and figure out how to figure out an exact number, because there is still a process to that. It's a simple process. But for today's lesson, I wanted you guys to know, in order to apply the apportionment principle, how to split things up fairly, we have to take all the populations, we add them up. Once you add them up, to find our divisor, you take this number and divide by how much you're splitting, which before the case was 45 seats, 45 representatives. When we did 64,620, divided by 45, it gave us 1,436. Because once you had that, now the way we find our quota is take every population divided by that. So this divided by that gave us that. 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 And that's how you find the quotas. You just divide by the divisor. Next lesson, again, we're going to figure out exactly how many representatives. So we're going to analyze these decimals and then ways to actually split everything when it doesn't work out perfectly to figure out the exact number of representatives. Hope this helped, guys. If you have any questions, again, feel free to ask me. Even feel free to rewind. Take care.